Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about an actor people my age will be surprised to learn was a voice actor in An American Tail, Fievel Goes West, and older audience members and their kids will remember from the absolute Christmas classic, It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah, that's right. We're talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Jimmy Stewart, with a script penned by the ever-factual Larry Holsworth, and some side commentary from yours truly. If Larry has provided socials to us, we'll link them right alongside my Cosmic Analog Horror Project, OEI, my storytelling analysis and podcast channel, Story Rant, and with that, we'll start with a little quote from Jimmy Stewart himself, one that a few people in the comments have probably said about my speaking speed. Wink. If I had my career over again, maybe I'd say to myself, speed it up a little. James Maitland Stewart is that rare and admirable human being who could truthfully claim that everyone liked him. During his life and in the years since, it was virtually impossible to find anyone recording a bad word against him, or relating an anecdote in which he appeared less than a gentleman. His distinctive drawl, coupled with his hesitant, stuttering vocal delivery, made his voice instantly recognizable. And when it was heard, it was heated. Late in his long and distinguished career, he provided the voiceover for a major soup company's television commercials. He did not physically appear in the advertisements. Campbell's reported hundreds of telephone calls to their offices, demanding to know that if that really was Jimmy's voice promoting their soup. And it really was. After all, said the American public, Jimmy Stewart didn't stoop to doing television commercials, and how could a company afford him and not even show his face? To the public, he was always viewed that way, honest, personable, as familiar as one's own family, as comfortable as a favorite sweater. He was Jimmy Stewart, except that he wasn't. He made 80 films, appeared on stage in dozens of plays, and on television in dramas, sitcoms, variety shows, and talk shows. In all of them, with one notable exception, he was credited as James Stewart. Jimmy was for his friends and family, James for the public. Yet the public knew him and still knows him as Jimmy Stewart. Perhaps that's acceptable, since to the public, he was always much more than a remote Hollywood star. He was family, he was a friend, he was the naive Mr. Smith, everyman, encountering the diabolical corruption of the swamp of 1930s Washington, D.C. He was George Bailey, the small-town banker and family man, who longed for something else. He played newspaper reporters, police detectives, musicians, aviators, the befuddled companion of an invisible rabbit. Yes, and many other roles. Yet to the public, he always came through as Jimmy Stewart, invariably honest, thoroughly decent, good to his very bones. Here is a look at the wonderful life of James Stewart. James Stewart was born in the unusually named town of Indiana, Pennsylvania on May 20th, 1908, the firstborn to Alexander and Elizabeth Stewart. Eventually, two sisters were also born to the family. Alexander Stewart ran the family's hardware store, J.M. Stewart and Company Hardware, which had been in the family for generations, and which Alexander hoped would one day be passed down to his own son, as had been traditional in the family. As a child, young James, who did go by Jimmy as a youth, worked in the store, attended grammar school, and taught himself to play the accordion on an instrument a customer used to square a debt. You see, Jimmy learned that his barber played, and lessons were exchanged for odd jobs, including sweeping the barber shop. Jimmy remained a devoted accordion player for the rest of his life. He also had a paper route, and he saved his money to pay for flying lessons after the aviation bug hit him in the 1920s. He was an inattentive student at the Wilson Model School, where he attended elementary and junior high school. Jimmy preferred to spend his time drawing airplanes, making model airplanes after classes, and in general, daydreaming, probably about airplanes. His grades were below average, and his academic performance became a source of concern for his father. Another family tradition for the Stewarts was for the males of the family to attend Princeton University. Alexander Stewart was a member of the class of 1898. Determined that his only son would continue the tradition, he enrolled Jimmy in Mercersburg Academy, a private institution, in 1923. At Mercersburg, Jimmy enjoyed extracurricular activities, including running track and singing in the Glee Club. But to his disappointment, his spare, lanky physique proved unsuitable for football, which will be kind of funny later on. It was at Mercersburg that Jimmy first encountered the acting bug, appearing in a production during his senior year in 1928. That senior year came 1 year later than normal. Jimmy having become ill in 1927 with a severe kidney infection, brought about by scarlet fever. That same year, Charles Lindbergh electrified the world with his solo transatlantic flight. Alexander Stewart dreamed of his son inheriting the family hardware store. The son preferred the beckoning career of an aviator. The father won out though, and after graduating from Mercersburg in 1928, Jimmy dutifully acquiesced to family tradition and enrolled at Princeton, class of 1932, with the intention of studying architecture. He spent his spare time at Princeton dreaming of building a relatively new form of infrastructure, airports and air freight terminals. Despite the aspirations of his father and Stewart family tradition, the 4 years James Stewart spent at Princeton spelled the end of his career as a hardware merchant. Young Jimmy found he was popular at Princeton, enjoyed singing in the Glee Club, and joined the Charter Club. The latter was a male-only club dedicated to eating and drinking. Despite the good food and plenty Jimmy enjoyed at the club, he still failed to gain weight, and his lanky 6-foot 3-inch frame was easily spotted on the Princeton campus. It was also easily spotted on stage, where James Stewart found he had a decided taste for appearances, you might say. He joined the Triangle Club, an on-campus theater troupe. The Triangle Club performed student-written plays and reviews, which is pronounced like a movie review but spelled R-E-V-U-E-S, and apparently consisted of a bunch of skits, singing, dancing, and monologuing, each act not having much, if anything, to do with anything else in the routine. It sounds similar to And Now for Something Completely Different by Monty Python, but hopefully the theater people in the comments can say for sure, if there are any. These reviews traditionally ended with an all-male kickline and drag, which also sounds like Monty Python. His grades at Princeton were exemplary, and upon graduation in 1932 he received a scholarship for advanced study, based on his thesis for airport design. Despite his love of all things aviation, he declined, choosing instead to turn his back on aviation, architecture, and the family store. The stage called to him, and Jimmy went to Cape Cod to join an intercollegiate summer stock company called the University Players. That summer of 1932 proved pivotal in his life. He performed on stage in numerous small roles and became close friends with another young actor, Henry Fonda, who was there with his wife Margaret Sullivan. By summer's end, Fonda and Sullivan were divorced, and Henry and Jimmy relocated to New York and Broadway. Sullivan moved to New York as well, and Stewart remained close with both halves of the estranged couple. In New York, Stewart appeared in small roles, occasionally with Sullivan, who was a budding star. His stature ensured he was noticed by both audiences and critics, yet his tall and spare appearance was not all about him that was memorable. Unlike most actors of the period, he made no attempt to adopt foreign accents or affectations of speech as demanded by his roles, retaining his Pennsylvania drawl and simple mannerisms during his infrequent speaking parts. Gradually, his roles grew more substantial. By 1934, he was cast in the lead in notable productions, often to excellent reviews from critics, but without a major hit to add to his resume. He made his first appearance on film that summer in 1934, albeit without a cast credit, in a short comedy produced by Howard, one of the 6 performers who comprised, at different times, the act known as the Three Stooges. Whether Shemp used his influence to further Stewart's career is debated. The sometime stooge claimed he worked for the actor behind the scenes, as it were, but there is no evidence of his doing so. Stewart continued to perform in live theater in New York and in summer stock, in diverse roles as well as in minor roles in film. In 1936, Jimmy appeared billed as James Stewart in the William Powell Myrna Loy featured sequel to the popular The Thin Man, titled after The Thin Man. Stewart earned rave reviews from critics for his performance in the film, though few saw his potential as a leading man in future roles. MGM called. Studio executives there viewed him as performing in roles similar to what he took on in After the Thin Man. Important to the story, but a second-tier actor. Supportive rather than a leading man. Soon he was under contract, though. Stewart found himself in numerous such roles in the late 1930s, appearing in films alongside Clark Gable, Jean Harlow, Myrna Loy, and other top-flight MGM stars. In the studio system of the day, he was assigned roles by executives, had little to say over what they were, and was threatened with being fired if he were to turn them down. He appeared in upwards of 7 films per year, which sounds like a lot if the workdays were anything like modern-day films. Usually, though, he was a secondary performer, though his reviews were usually stellar. In 1937, he finally received top billing alongside Lionel Barrymore and Robert Young in the film Navy Blue and Gold, which proved a critical and box office success, though his casting as a football player went decidedly against type. That's that funny thing I was talking about earlier. He was still tall and thin, almost painfully so he did not look like a football player. Gradually, through several films, Stewart enhanced his credentials as a leading man in Hollywood, working opposite several of the most popular actresses in movies at the time. Many of those actresses came to insist on Stewart working with them, among them the aforementioned Margaret Sullivan, Ginger Rogers, Myrna Loy, Carole Lombard, Jean Arthur, and others. Critics noticed him too. His reviews were uniformly good, with the notable exception of when he ill-advisedly appeared in a musical, Born to Dance. Variety magazine called his singing and dancing rather painful. Ouch. The New York Times commented, "His singing and dancing will fortunately never win him a song and dance man classification." Related to this, I found this quote while doing research for presenting this video that I'm pretty sure is in regard to the reviews of this musical. "I lasted one night. They said my playing spoiled people's appetites." He also said in regard to the women he worked with that when it came to kissing, Harlow was best. Stewart closed out the 1930s with two major box office hits, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Destry Rides Again. In the former, Stewart demonstrated his honest, everyman confronting corruption and power persona, appearing with Jean Arthur, Thomas Mitchell, and Claude Rains. In a world appointed to a U.S. Senate seat by a corrupt political machine, Stewart's Mr. Smith takes them on, supported by Boy Scouts, American morals, and the memory of Abe Lincoln. His performance cemented him as a major star in Hollywood, despite his gee-whiz innocence and simple-minded honesty, which in a later day would be called corny. In Destry Rides Again, Stewart played a Western hero who is anti-gun, anti-violence, and prefers to be civil with everyone, including the corrupt town bosses he confronts. Despite his aversion to violence, he is skilled with guns and fisticuffs and brings the town to heel, as well as the saloon girl played by Marlene Dietrich, who in German should be pronounced Dietrich. But in the US, we would butcher it as Dietrich, which I just did. Destry Rides Again was filmed as a comedy, and Stewart's portrayal as the hero-anti-hero was well received by critics. Stewart thus entered the 1940s as a major star, and a role he took on in 1940 placed him at the very top of the Hollywood pantheon. No, not It's a Wonderful Life, that comes later. In the Philadelphia Story, he starred with Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. According to critics, much of Stewart's performance was intended as comic relief, and the role won him the Academy Award as Best Actor in a Leading Role. Stewart regarded his role in the film as being a supporting one, though he accepted the award. He actually sent it to his father, who displayed it in the family hardware store in Indiana, Pennsylvania, which is actually pretty sweet, as all too often we hear about actors being shunned by their family for going against the grain. As James Stewart rose in the ranks of Hollywood stars, he also gained attention as one of Hollywood's most eligible bachelors. In a later day, he would have been called a playboy, but in 1930s Hollywood, that term was frowned upon. At the time, studio heads protected the reputation of their stars, often creating fictional social lives for them, concerned that suspicion of immorality might negatively affect box office receipts. James Stewart was considered America's everyman, with simple tastes, what would one day be called family values, honest, honorable, faithful. Nonetheless, Hedda Hopper, whose gossip column was widely popular, called Stewart the Great American Bachelor. He was involved in relationships with Marlene Dietrich, Ginger Rogers, Loretta Young, Norma Shearer, Dinah Shore, and Olivia de Havilland at different times, as well as many other women, some married, some single. He was a dog, apparently. Reportedly, he did propose marriage to Olivia de Havilland in the early 1940s, though she turned him down. On the other hand, Loretta Young wanted to settle down with Stewart, which led him to terminate their relationship. I guess he just didn't know what he wanted. He enjoyed his status as an unattached bachelor, as well as being a noted man about town, carousing with his friends including Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, Ronald Reagan, yes, that one, David Niven, and others. He was quite coy with reporters regarding his private life, allowing the studio to speak for him regarding his relationships, as you can probably imagine why. James Stewart entered military service in early 1941, months before the Japanese attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. He enlisted as a private, received a commission due to his experience as an amateur pilot and his college degree, and on New Year's Day 1942 was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Army Air Corps. The Army took advantage of his fame to use him in training and recruiting films, as well as radio and public appearances, but for Stewart that was not enough. He insisted on combat training and duty, and he got what he wanted. His fame was such that upon his arrival in the European theater, the British traitor and German propagandist Lord Haha welcomed Stewart in a radio broadcast. James Stewart flew B-24 Liberator bombers on 20 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and the French Croix de Guerre. He became deputy commander of the 2nd Bombardment Wing, rose in rank from lieutenant to full colonel, and as a leader earned the respect and devotion of his men. On one occasion, then Major Stewart learned of an illegal keg of beer hidden in a barracks by some of the enlisted men under his command. Stewart visited the barracks, discovered the keg, poured himself a beer, and addressed his men, reminding them of the seriousness of violating regulations. He expressed confidence they would dispose of the keg before it was found. He then finished his beer and left. Nothing else was said about the incident, which is hilarious. Stewart remained in the Army Reserve post-war, transferring to the United States Air Force in 1948 and eventually flying jets including the B-52 Stratofortress. He flew as an observer over Vietnam in the 1960s. He eventually retired as a brigadier general. After World War II, he seldom spoke of his military service or wartime experiences, other than in support of veterans groups or Air Force recruiting. Stewart entered military service at a time when his acting career was just reaching its peak. However, post-military, he found he more or less had to start all over again. Finally, in 1946, James Stewart returned to films, playing George Bailey in that year's It's a Wonderful Life, an absolute Christmas classic today. But at the time, it was not well received by either critics or the paying public. Though Stewart did receive some accolades for his performance, including the comment that if his wife and he had a son, we'd want him to be just like Jimmy Stewart as he appeared in the film. The comment came from then President of the United States, Harry Truman. Subsequent roles such as Elwood P. Dowd in Harvey with his invisible rabbit companion added to his persona as an American icon, both fragile and beloved. He appeared in the role both on Broadway and its subsequent film version. As actors of his generation began to give way at the box office to a new generation including Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, Sal Mineo, Rod Steiger, he branched into other genres. He worked in film noir, portraying investigative reporters, detectives, baseball players, and victims, frequently in the role of the underdog seeking to right wrongs. In 1949, James Stewart, then well into his 40s, married Gloria McLean, a widow who he met 2 years previously, at a party in which he showed up slightly drunk. Despite the inauspicious beginning, they remained married until Gloria's death in 1994. Stewart adopted her 2 sons from her previous marriage, and they had twin daughters of their own in 1951. One of Stewart's adopted sons, Ronald, died in combat in Vietnam in 1969, serving in the United States Marine Corps. More than a dozen years later, Stewart discussed his son in a television interview, stating, "He wanted to be a Marine, and I encouraged it." Stewart denied his son's death was a tragedy, calling it instead a loss. A terrible, terrible loss. But tragic, no. He died for his country. An emotional Stewart then cut off the interview. In the 1950s, he ventured into westerns, as well as movies based on aviation, a true labor of love for the longtime pilot and Air Force veteran. He also worked with Alfred Hitchcock, alongside Kim Novak in Vertigo and Grace Kelly in Rear Window, which, even if you haven't seen yourself, you've definitely seen it parodied on countless shows like The Simpsons. In the latter film, he was confined to a wheelchair, forcing him to convey his reactions and emotions solely through his facial expressions and vocal responses. It remains one of Hitchcock's most popular films, though Stewart was not pleased that most of the praise for the film went to the director. He also appeared in a starring role in Hitchcock's experimental film Rope in 1948, which is an underrated classic. Most of the reviews for that film focused on Hitchcock's radical production techniques. The few mentions of Stewart concurred that he had been miscast. By contrast, his performance as a small-town attorney in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in Otto Preminger's Anatomy of a Murder drew lavish praise from critics. The New York Times called it one of the finest performances of his career. Popular with his fellow actors and the public alike, Stewart abandoned his man-about-town persona post-World War II, spending evenings at home with family or at the home of lifelong friend Henry Fonda, where the 2 Hollywood stars built model airplanes or played with electric railroad displays they constructed together, which is adorable. During breaks on film sets, Stewart was noted for amusing himself and members of the film crew by playing his accordion until he was required for scenes. He was reticent to discuss his private life, his family, his wartime experiences, or his views on Hollywood and his fellow stars. Yet he remained friendly with reporters, columnists, and the interviewers from the budding media of television. He didn't object to being called Jimmy, yet he continued to demand his credits list him as James Stewart, in a small way separating the man from his public persona. James Stewart made several forays into television in the 1960s and 1970s, appearing on variety shows, talk shows, and in 1971 as the star of a situation comedy on NBC. He portrayed a college professor living with his adult son and the son's family. The show was titled The Jimmy Stewart Show, the only time in his career he allowed himself to be credited as his nickname. The show only lasted one season. As his career wound down, he began to be a favorite for various awards and honorary appearances. In 1976, he joined John Wayne, who he'd actually worked with earlier on a western titled The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. This time around, Stewart played a doctor consulted by Wayne's character in The Shootist. By then, Stewart's hearing had deteriorated to the point that he frequently missed oral cues. The Shootist was Wayne's last film, and is often cited as Stewart's last as well, but in fact, Stewart appeared in a few more subsequent roles in film and television. He became a favorite guest of Johnny Carson's on The Tonight Show, and appeared as a voiceover only in the Campbell soup commercials we mentioned in the intro. A book of his poetry became popular after Stewart appeared on The Tonight Show and read an ode to his late dog Bo in 1981. Stewart's recitation in his iconic stammering drawl moved host Johnny Carson to tears. In the 1980s, Stewart remained in the public eye, in no small part because his longtime friend Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Stewart made numerous public appearances at the White House, as a guest at private functions with the First Family, as well as at formal state functions. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian award. He received the Kennedy Center Honors in 1983, his longtime friend and colleague Burt Lancaster handling the introduction. That time it was Stewart who was moved to tears. After his wife Gloria's death at the hands of lung cancer in 1994, the deeply private Stewart became reclusive, seldom venturing outside of the home which they had shared since purchasing it in 1951. According to his closest friend, he spent most of his time alone in his rooms. In 1996, he declined to have the batteries in his pacemaker replaced, and the following year he suffered a pulmonary embolism, which led to his death at the age of 89. He died at his home. More than 3,000 attended his memorial service and funeral, and he was buried at Forest Lawn in Glendale, California, with full military honors. President Bill Clinton, after hearing about his death, summed him up as a great actor, a gentleman, and a patriot. Clinton also referred to James Stewart as a national treasure. In an obituary in the Orlando Sentinel, writer Jay Boyar described Stewart as stammering and sincere, almost embarrassed by his decency. The writer also quoted Cary Grant, who had starred with Jimmy in the Philadelphia Story, and who had remained a lifelong friend. Jimmy had the ability to talk naturally, Grant had said. And then, some years later, Marlon Brando came out and did the same thing all over again. What people forget is that Jimmy did it first. Such was the regard he commanded from his fellow actors, the acclaim he received from critics, and the love he enjoyed from fans. His was truly a wonderful life, wonderfully lived. As Jay Boyar wrote, it's not only as an actor that we cherish him, but also as an emblem of something we want to believe is within all of us. And I think I have the perfect quote to leave this biography off on. Never treat your audience as customers, always as partners. Words that not only reflect on Jimmy Stewart's approach to the craft of acting, but something I think we can all agree studios and filmmakers could stand to learn from today. Well, I certainly hope you found this video to be entertaining and informative, and if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and keep it tuned here to Biographics for more videos like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.